At my father-in-law's funeral, my mother-in-law kicked my son and me out of the house, unaware of the $200 million he had left behind. Tai dam tang cua bio chong. Me chong da dui hai me con toi ra, koi nha. Hon ton kong beat, rang ongdd li mo ban, d chuk tri, gi, 200 true dola. If you're listening today, stay with me until the end of my story. And tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes the people who try hardest to push you down have no idea what's waiting around the corner. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 38 years old, a widow, and the mother of an 8-year-old boy named Noah. 3 years ago, my husband Michael died in a highway accident during a business trip. One careless moment from a distracted driver destroyed the life we had spent 12 years building together. After Michael passed away, my son and I moved into the estate owned by my father-in-law, Richard Whitmore. Richard was one of the most successful real estate developers in Illinois. People saw the private jets, the luxury homes, and the newspaper interviews, but I knew a different Richard. The man who attended every one of Noah's baseball games. The grandfather who secretly slipped $20 bills into his grandson's backpack. The man who sat beside me in silence every year on Michael's birthday because he knew words couldn't fix grief. That my mother-in-law, Margaret, was very different. She cared deeply about appearances. She loved social status, expensive jewelry, and reminding everyone how influential the Whitmore family was. For years, Richard balanced her out. When he was alive, nobody challenged him. After he died, everything changed. The funeral was held on a cold November morning. Gray clouds covered the sky. The wind cut through my black coat as Noah squeezed my hand. The church was packed. Politicians, business executives, charity leaders, people who wanted to be seen honoring Richard Whitmore. But despite the crowd, I had never felt more alone. After the service ended, guests slowly moved toward the cemetery. Margaret stood near the family limousine greeting visitors. She wore oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. At first, I thought she was hiding tears. That I was wrong. When the last guest left, Margaret turned toward me. Her expression instantly hardened. "Emily, we need to talk." Something in her voice made my stomach tighten. Noah stayed beside me. I knelt and brushed his hair back. "Why don't you wait in the car for a minute, sweetheart?" He nodded and walked away. The moment he was out of earshot, Margaret crossed her arms. "Now that Richard is gone, it's time for you to leave the estate." I blinked. "What? You heard me." She didn't lower her voice. "The guest house was only available because Richard insisted. That arrangement is over." I stared at her. I honestly thought grief had made her say something she didn't mean, but then she continued. "I want you and Noah out by Friday." The funeral had ended less than an hour earlier. I could still smell fresh flowers from the church, and she was already evicting us. I felt my chest tighten. "Margaret, Noah just lost his grandfather. He'll survive." The words landed like ice. That I looked at her carefully. For the first time, I realized she wasn't grieving. She was calculating that Richard's body hadn't even been buried yet, and she was already reorganizing her kingdom. That a black SUV pulled up nearby. That Richard's attorney stepped out. His name was Daniel Brooks. For over 20 years, he had handled nearly every legal matter for Richard. That he looked serious. When his eyes met mine, something flashed across his face. Concern, maybe even urgency. But before he could approach us, Margaret intercepted him. They spoke quietly. That I couldn't hear the words, but I noticed Daniel glance toward me twice. Whatever he wanted to say, he never got the chance. That evening, Noah and I returned to the guest house. The estate felt different, empty, cold, unwelcoming. I tucked Noah into bed. "Mom." "Yeah, buddy. Grandma doesn't like us very much, does she?" My heart broke. Children always know more than adults think. I forced a smile. "No matter what happens, we're going to be okay." After he fell asleep, I sat alone in the kitchen. That's when my phone rang. "Unknown number." I answered. "Emily." It was Daniel Brooks. His voice sounded tense. "There is something you need to know." I sat upright. "What is it?" There was a pause. Then he said something that changed everything. "Richard left very specific instructions before he died." My pulse quickened. "What instructions?" Another pause. Then Daniel lowered his voice. "The official reading of the will is next week. But trust me, Emily, Margaret has no idea what's coming. And neither did I." Part 2. English. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Richard's face. Not the face everyone knew from magazine covers and business conferences. The face I remembered was softer. The grandfather who let Noah stay up too late on summer nights. The man who never forgot a birthday. The father-in-law who treated me like a daughter long after Michael was gone. The guest house was quiet except for the occasional sound of wind brushing against the windows. At around 3 in the morning, I finally gave up trying to sleep and walked into the kitchen. The estate stretched beyond the dark glass. 40 acres of manicured lawns, private gardens, and century-old oak trees. Most people would have looked at that property and seen wealth. I saw memories. Michael teaching Noah how to ride a bicycle near the south driveway. Richard grilling hamburgers every 4th of July. Family dinners that lasted long after sunset. For years, I had believed those memories meant something. Now I wasn't so sure. Margaret's words kept replaying in my head. I want you and Noah out by Friday. Not next month. Not after the holidays. Friday. 3 days. 3 days to pack up the life we'd built since Michael died. 3 days to explain to an 8-year-old boy why his home was suddenly disappearing. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat alone at the kitchen table. That's when I noticed something. Richard's favorite mug was still sitting on the shelf. A simple white mug with a tiny chip near the handle. Worthless to anyone else. Priceless to me. For some reason, seeing that mug nearly broke me. Because it reminded me that Richard was really gone. And somehow, the people he trusted most seemed determined to erase him as quickly as possible. The next morning, Noah came downstairs wearing his baseball cap. The same cap Richard had bought him 2 summers earlier. Mom. Yeah, buddy. Are we really moving? Children always ask the questions adults try hardest to avoid. I set down my coffee. We might have to. He looked down at the floor. For a moment, he seemed much older than 8. Did Grandma tell us to leave because Grandpa died? The innocence in that question hurt. More than any insult Margaret had thrown at me. I pulled him into a hug. No matter where we live, we'll still be together. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. Neither was I. Around noon, I started packing. Not because I wanted to, because I had no choice. Every room contained pieces of our life. Photographs, school projects, Christmas decorations, boxes Michael had never gotten around to organizing before the accident. By late afternoon, the guest house looked like a storage unit. Cardboard boxes lined every wall. Noah's toys were stacked beside the fireplace. I felt exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. Then my phone rang again. Daniel Brooks. Emily, are you alone? His voice sounded cautious. Yes. Good. The silence that followed made me nervous. I need to ask you something. What? Did Richard ever discuss his estate with you? The question surprised me. No. Never. Not really. Daniel exhaled slowly. Interesting. What does that mean? Another pause. Then he changed the subject. Just be careful over the next few days. My stomach tightened. Careful of what? I can't explain yet. That answer frustrated me. But before I could push further, he spoke again. Has Margaret mentioned the will? No. Not once. No. Daniel was silent. Then he said something strange. That tells me everything I need to know. Before I could ask another question, he ended the call. I stared at my phone. Confused, anxious, and more curious than ever. That evening, a black Mercedes pulled into the driveway. Margaret. I watched through the window as she stepped out. She looked perfectly composed. Perfect hair. Perfect coat. Perfect smile. The kind of smile people wear when they think they've already won. She didn't knock. She walked straight inside. Packing already? Her voice carried a hint of satisfaction. I forced myself to stay calm. Yes. Good. She glanced around the room. Her eyes moved across the boxes. The photographs. The furniture. Almost as if she were inspecting property instead of speaking to family. Then her gaze landed on Noah. He was sitting quietly on the couch reading. For a brief moment, I expected some kindness. Some sign that she still loved her grandson. Instead, she said, the sooner this is finished, the easier it will be for everyone. Noah lowered his book. I saw the hurt in his eyes. And something inside me hardened. Not anger. Not yet. Determination. Margaret left 20 minutes later. The house felt lighter after she was gone. But the damage remained. That night, after Noah fell asleep, I opened one of the storage boxes from the garage. I wasn't looking for anything specific. Just trying to stay busy. Inside were old photo albums. Letters. Documents. And near the bottom, I found a small leather notebook. Richard's handwriting covered the first page. My heart skipped. I carefully opened it. Most of the entries were business notes, meeting schedules, investment reminders, property information. Then I reached a page dated 6 months earlier. One sentence caught my attention immediately. If anything happens to me, Daniel knows exactly what to do. I read it twice, then 3 times. The handwriting was unmistakably Richard's. Suddenly Daniel's strange phone calls made a little more sense. Whatever was happening, Richard had planned for it. And for the first time since the funeral, I began to suspect that Margaret might not be in control nearly as much as she believed. I just didn't know how wrong she was. End of Part 2. Part 3, English. The next morning, I woke up with Richard's notebook still sitting on the kitchen table. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. One sentence. That was all it contained that seemed important. If anything happens to me, Daniel knows exactly what to do. Yet somehow, that sentence refused to leave my mind. Richard had never been careless with words, especially not in writing. Everything he did was intentional. Every business deal, every investment, every promise. And if he had written those words 6 months before his death, they meant something. I just didn't know what. Friday was getting closer. The deadline Margaret had given us hung over my head like a storm cloud. I spent the morning continuing to pack. Noah helped where he could, mostly by putting his favorite toys into boxes and asking questions I didn't know how to answer. Mom, where are we going to live? I'm working on that. Will we still be close to Grandpa's house? I don't know. The uncertainty in my own voice bothered me. For most of Noah's life, I had always had answers. Now I had almost none. Around noon, I decided to call a realtor friend. If we had to leave, I needed a plan. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Apartments, rental homes, school districts, budgets, reality. Every option felt smaller than the life we were leaving behind. Not because I cared about luxury, but because it was another reminder that Michael was gone, that Richard was gone, and that the family I thought I belonged to was disappearing right in front of me. After the call ended, I walked outside to clear my head. The estate was unusually quiet. Most of the staff had been given time off after the funeral. The gardens looked untouched. The fountains stood silent. For the first time in years, the property felt empty. As I walked past the main house, I noticed movement through one of the windows. Margaret. She was sitting at Richard's desk. His desk. A place nobody touched without permission. Even after 30 years of marriage, she rarely sat there. Yet now she looked completely at home. Papers were spread across the surface. Several folders lay open beside her. And standing next to her was a man I didn't recognize. Tall, expensive suit, confident posture. The two of them appeared deep in conversation. I stopped walking. Something felt wrong. Not illegal. Not obvious. Just wrong. The kind of feeling you get when pieces of a puzzle don't fit together. Then Margaret suddenly looked up. For a split second, our eyes met through the glass. Her expression changed instantly. The folder in front of her disappeared beneath a stack of papers. The stranger stepped backward, and moments later, the curtains were closed. I continued walking, but my instincts were screaming. That evening, Daniel called again. This time his voice sounded more urgent. Emily, has anyone contacted you about Richard's business interests? No. What about Margaret? No. Daniel was quiet. Then he asked a question that surprised me. Did Richard ever give Noah anything? I frowned. What do you mean? A gift? A document? A key? Anything unusual? I thought about it. At first, nothing came to mind. Then I remembered something. About 8 months earlier, Richard had given Noah a small wooden box. It wasn't expensive, just an old handcrafted keepsake box. Noah had loved it because it looked like a treasure chest. Actually, yes. Daniel immediately became interested. What kind of box? I described it. The wood, the brass latch, the engraved initials. For several seconds, Daniel said nothing. Then he asked carefully, do you still have it? I think so. Find it. The seriousness in his voice caught me off guard. Why? Just find it. Before I could ask another question, he added something else. And don't tell Margaret. My heart started beating faster. The call ended. I stood motionless in the kitchen. A wooden box? Why would an old keepsake matter? Unless it wasn't just a keepsake. I immediately went upstairs. Noah was doing homework at his desk. Hey, buddy. Yeah. Do you remember the wooden box Grandpa gave you? His face brightened. The treasure box? That's the one. I still have it. Relief washed over me. Where? He pointed toward his closet. 10 minutes later, We found it on a shelf behind several board games. The box looked exactly as I remembered. Dark walnut wood. Polished brass latch. Richard's initials carved into the lid. R.W. Richard Whitmore. I carefully opened it. Inside were baseball cards. A few coins. Old movie tickets. Small treasures collected by an 8-year-old boy. Nothing unusual. Nothing valuable. At least, not at first glance. Then I noticed something. The bottom looked thicker than it should have. I turned the box over. Tapped the wood. Listened. Hollow. My pulse quickened. There was definitely something hidden inside. I examined every corner. Every seam. Every hinge. Finally, near one edge, I discovered a tiny sliding panel almost invisible to the eye. My hands trembled as I pushed it. Click. A hidden compartment opened. Inside was a small envelope. And a silver key. For a moment, I simply stared. Noah looked just as confused. Mom. I carefully picked up the envelope. My name was written across the front. Emily. In Richard's handwriting. The room suddenly felt very quiet. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten note. Only one sentence. Trust Daniel. Not Margaret. I read it twice. Then 3 times. My hands shook. Because suddenly everything was changing. The strange phone calls. The hidden notebook. The secret compartment. The warning. Richard had known something before he died. Something important enough to hide. Something important enough to protect from his own wife. And whatever it was, I was beginning to realize the battle over Richard Whitmore's fortune hadn't even started yet. End of Part 3. Part 4. English. I didn't sleep much that night. The note Richard left behind sat on the kitchen table beside the silver key. Trust Daniel. Not Margaret. Only 4 words. Yet they carried more weight than anything else I had heard since Richard's funeral. I must have read them 20 times. Every time I looked at them, new questions appeared. Why couldn't Richard trust his own wife? What was Daniel protecting? And most importantly, what did the key open? By sunrise, I had made up my mind. I was done sitting around waiting for answers. I called Daniel. He answered immediately. Did you find it? His voice sounded almost relieved. Yes. The box. Yes. The note. Yes. The key too. For a moment, he said nothing. Then I heard him exhale. Thank God. The word startled me. Daniel, what is going on? I can't explain everything over the phone. Then explain what you can. There was a long pause. Finally, he spoke. Richard spent the last year of his life preparing for something. My heart skipped. Preparing for what? Conflict. The answer sent a chill through me. Conflict with who? Another pause. Then Daniel said quietly, Margaret. I felt the room spin. For 30 years, Richard and Margaret had been one of the most powerful couples in Illinois. People admired them, respected them, envied them. And now Daniel was telling me Richard had been preparing for a battle against his own wife. You're going to need proof before you'll believe me, Daniel said. Then give me proof. I will. When? Today. 3 hours later, I met him at a small cafe 30 miles from the estate. Not a fancy place. Not somewhere Margaret would ever visit. The moment Daniel arrived, he looked exhausted. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked worried. Truly worried. He sat across from me and slid a thick envelope onto the table. Read this. Inside were copies of financial reports, corporate records, property transfers, bank statements. At first, none of it made sense. Then Daniel pointed to several highlighted sections. My eyes widened. Millions of dollars. Repeatedly moved between accounts. Properties quietly transferred into shell companies. Investments sold. Without Richard's knowledge. At least, according to the documents. What am I looking at? Daniel leaned forward. For years, Margaret has been moving assets. I stared at him. What? Not stealing. Then what? Hiding. The distinction confused me. Daniel continued. Richard discovered it about 18 months ago. I felt my stomach tighten. And he started investigating. The cafe suddenly felt very small. I looked back at the papers. Every page revealed another secret. Another hidden transaction. Another unexplained movement of money. How much? Daniel looked directly at me. More than $50 million. I nearly dropped the folder. 50 million. The number didn't even feel real. And Richard knew? Daniel nodded. Eventually. What did he do? A sad smile crossed Daniel's face. What Richard always did. Which was, he planned. That answer sounded exactly like Richard. Never emotional. Never impulsive. Always prepared. Always thinking 3 moves ahead. Daniel reached into his briefcase. Then he placed another item on the table. A photograph. I immediately recognized it. A safety deposit vault, located in a private bank downtown. My eyes shifted toward the silver key in my purse. Suddenly, everything clicked. The key. Daniel nodded. The key. I stared at him. What is inside? I honestly don't know. That surprised me. You don't know? Richard never told me. Then why are you so sure it's important? Daniel gave a small laugh. Because Richard spent 6 months making sure Margaret would never find it. That was enough for me. After lunch, we drove directly to the bank. The building stood in the financial district. Tall, quiet, private. The kind of place wealthy families used when they wanted absolute discretion. As we entered, I could feel my pulse racing. Everything was moving too quickly. 3 days earlier, I had been grieving my father-in-law. Now I was uncovering secrets that stretched back years. A bank manager escorted us downstairs. The vault area was heavily secured. Steel doors, security cameras, electronic access panels. Finally, we reached a small private room. A long metal box sat waiting on the table. The manager looked at me. Whenever you're ready. My hands trembled as I inserted the silver key. Click. The lock opened. The manager left the room. Daniel and I were alone. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then I slowly lifted the lid. Inside were 3 things. A sealed envelope, a flash drive, and a thick leather folder. Daniel looked as stunned as I felt. The envelope had my name on it. Again, Emily, in Richard's handwriting. I carefully opened it. Inside was a letter, several pages long. As I began reading, my eyes filled with tears. Because the first line said something I never expected. Emily, if you're reading this, it means I was right about Margaret. And suddenly, I realized this was much bigger than a will. Much bigger than money. Richard had been trying to protect someone. For a very long time. And that someone was us. End of part 4. Part 5, English. My hands trembled as I continued reading Richard's letter. Daniel sat quietly across from me. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush me. He simply waited. Because whatever Richard had written, Daniel had clearly never seen it before. The letter began simply. Emily, if you're reading this, then 2 things have happened. First, I am gone. Second, Margaret has shown you exactly who she is. Tears blurred my vision. Even in death, Richard's voice felt unmistakably present. I could almost hear him speaking the words. Slow, calm, deliberate, the way he always had. I continued reading. For many years, I convinced myself that loyalty and love were the same thing. I was wrong. I swallowed hard. The next paragraph was even worse. Margaret stopped loving me long before I admitted it to myself. What remained was ambition. And ambition can become dangerous when it believes it deserves everything. My heart sank. I had never imagined Richard writing something like this. Not about his wife. Not after 30 years of marriage. Yet every sentence carried the weight of painful truth. Richard explained that he first became suspicious nearly 2 years earlier. At first, it was small things. Missing documents. Investment reports that never arrived. Property records that seemed incomplete. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just enough to make him start asking questions. And once Richard started asking questions, he never stopped. That investigation eventually led him to discover dozens of hidden transactions. Millions of dollars moved without his approval. Companies created without his knowledge. Assets quietly relocated beyond his reach. The deeper he dug, the more concerned he became. But one section of the letter made me stop breathing. Emily, the money was never the thing that frightened me. I read the sentence twice, then 3 times. What frightened me was learning who Margaret had become. A chill ran through my body. I looked at Daniel. His face had turned pale. Apparently, he had reached the same sentence. I continued reading. After Michael died, I paid closer attention to how Margaret treated you and Noah. At first, I believed grief was responsible. Then I realized something much worse. She viewed you both as obstacles. I felt physically sick. The letter continued. She never forgave Michael for being my favorite child. And she never forgave Noah for becoming my favorite grandchild. Tears rolled down my cheeks. Because deep down, I knew it was true. Richard adored Noah. Everyone knew it. And Margaret had never hidden her jealousy particularly well. Still, seeing it written in Richard's own words felt devastating. Then I reached the final page. And everything changed. Emily, if Margaret has already forced you to leave the estate, then events are moving faster than I expected. I froze. Richard had predicted it. Months before his death. Maybe longer. He had known exactly what Margaret would do. The realization sent chills down my spine. The next paragraph was underlined. If that has happened, do not return to the estate until the reading of my will. I immediately looked up at Daniel. He nodded slowly. As soon as Margaret forced you out, I suspected Richard had anticipated it. I looked back down at the letter. There was still one page remaining, and it contained the most shocking revelation yet. Everything Margaret believes she owns is temporary. I stared at the sentence. Then I kept reading. The version of my estate she believes exists no longer exists. My pulse quickened. Daniel leaned forward. Neither of us spoke. Richard continued. Over the last 18 months, I restructured everything. Everything. The word echoed inside my head. Everything. The letter didn't explain further. Instead, it ended with one final instruction. Trust Daniel. Protect Noah. And whatever happens, attend a reading. That was it. No dramatic farewell. No emotional goodbye. Just instructions. Classic Richard. I carefully folded the letter. For several moments, neither Daniel nor I spoke. Finally, I broke the silence. What does he mean by restructured everything? Daniel rubbed his forehead. I think I know. You think? Richard moved most of his holdings into a private trust. My eyes widened. A trust? Daniel nodded. But I never knew the final structure. Why not? Because Richard refused to tell anyone. That sounded exactly like him. If he wanted something protected, nobody got access. Not even his closest advisors. Daniel glanced toward the leather folder inside the vault. That may contain the answers. My pulse quickened again. I had almost forgotten about the folder. Slowly, I opened it. The first page immediately revealed the title. The Whitmore Family Legacy Trust. Daniel's eyes widened. Then mine did too. The estimated value listed below nearly made me stop breathing. $200 million. $200 million. For several seconds, the room fell completely silent. I looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at me. Neither of us spoke. Because we both understood the same thing at exactly the same moment. Margaret had no idea. The woman who had already begun throwing us out. The woman who believed she controlled Richard's empire. The woman currently sitting in the estate planning her future. She had absolutely no idea what was waiting for her at the official reading of the will. And for the first time since the funeral, I wasn't afraid anymore. End of Part 5. Part 6. English. For the first time since Richard's funeral, I felt something I hadn't experienced in days. Hope. Not certainty. Not victory. Just hope. The kind that appears when you finally realize you're not as powerless as everyone wants you to believe. Daniel carefully closed the trust documents and looked at me. Now you understand why Richard was worried. I nodded slowly. Margaret thinks she inherited an empire. Exactly. And she doesn't know most of it is protected. Daniel leaned back in his chair. She knows some things. Some. Enough to be dangerous. That answer immediately caught my attention. What does that mean? Daniel hesitated. Then he reached into the leather folder again. This time he removed several pages that had been clipped together. I wasn't going to show you these until later. My stomach tightened. Show me what? The last 6 months of Richard's notes. I took the papers. Most were handwritten. A few were typed. Every page carried dates and observations. The further I read, the more uncomfortable I became. Richard had been documenting everything. Conversations, meetings, behavioral changes, suspicious financial activity. It was less a business record and more a private investigation. One note in particular stood out. March 14th. Margaret requested access to trust documents. Request denied. Became unusually aggressive afterward. Another note. April 3rd. Unknown financial consultant observed meeting privately with Margaret. Relationship unclear. Then another. May 27th. Margaret asked multiple questions regarding succession procedures if I were to die unexpectedly. I froze. Unexpectedly. The word seemed to jump off the page. I looked at Daniel. Did Richard really write this? Daniel nodded. Every word. A cold sensation spread through my chest. This wasn't about greed anymore. This wasn't about inheritance. Something far more disturbing had been happening. Richard had been keeping records because he felt threatened. The realization was difficult to process. The man had spent his life negotiating billion-dollar deals, competing against ruthless businessmen, surviving hostile takeovers. Yet near the end of his life, the person he feared most appeared to be sitting across the dinner table. His own wife. I continued reading. Several pages later, another entry stopped me. August 11th. Emily and Noah remain unaware. Need to keep it that way. If Margaret realizes my intentions, she may act sooner than expected. I swallowed hard. Richard had been protecting us, even while fighting battles we never knew existed. The thought made my eyes sting. Daniel quietly handed me a tissue. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Finally, I looked up. What happens now? Daniel glanced at his watch. The will is read in 48 hours. 2 days. Only 2 days remained. Can Margaret challenge the trust? Daniel shook his head. Not successfully. What if she tries? A faint smile appeared. She will. The certainty in his voice surprised me. You're sure? Absolutely. Why? Daniel laughed softly. Because I've known Margaret for 25 years. That answer was enough. As we left the bank, my phone buzzed. Margaret. The sight of her name instantly changed my mood. I hadn't spoken to her since she ordered us out. For a moment, I considered ignoring the call. Then I answered. Hello. Her voice sounded unusually pleasant. Almost cheerful. Emily. The sweetness felt forced. Artificial. Yes. I wanted to check on you and Noah. I nearly laughed. After everything she had done, suddenly she wanted to check on us? I see. We're family. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. I remained silent. Margaret continued. I've been thinking. That was never a good sign. Thinking about what? Perhaps I was too harsh. I exchanged a glance with Daniel. He immediately noticed the change in my expression. What do you mean? I may have spoken emotionally after the funeral. The performance was almost impressive. Almost. Are you saying we can stay? There was a pause. Not a long one. Just long enough. No. There it was. The truth. But perhaps we can discuss a financial arrangement. My grip tightened around the phone. A financial arrangement. Not an apology. Not compassion. Money. Everything always came back to money. What kind of arrangement? Margaret lowered her voice. I'd like to avoid unnecessary conflict. Daniel's eyebrows immediately rose. He could hear enough of the conversation to understand. And suddenly he looked very interested. What conflict? Margaret paused. Then she said something that revealed more than she intended. Future misunderstandings involving Richard's estate. My pulse quickened. She was nervous. For the first time, Margaret was nervous. She knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough to make her worried. I decided to push. What exactly are you offering? Another pause. Then she named a number. $5 million. Even Daniel looked surprised. I almost dropped the phone. $5 million. For silence. For cooperation. For disappearing. Whatever Margaret believed was about to happen, she was clearly terrified of it. And that fear told me something important. Richard's plan was working. I ended the call shortly afterward. The moment I hung up, Daniel spoke. Well, I stared at the dark phone screen. She knows. Daniel nodded. Not everything. No. But enough. Yes. We stood silently outside the bank. The city moved around us. Traffic. Pedestrians. Business meetings. Normal life. Yet beneath all of it, something massive was unfolding. A secret Richard had spent nearly 2 years preparing. A secret worth $200 million. A secret that was about to explode in front of everyone. And for the very first time, Margaret Whitmore was beginning to realize she might lose. End of Part 6. Part 7. English. The next 48 hours felt longer than the entire week that had come before them. Every hour seemed stretched. Every phone call felt important. Every unexpected sound made me nervous. The official reading of Richard Whitmore's will was scheduled for Friday morning at 10 o'clock. The same Friday Margaret had ordered Noah and me to leave the estate. The irony wasn't lost on me. By Thursday evening, most of the Whitmore family had already arrived in town. Relatives I hadn't seen in years suddenly appeared. Cousins, uncles, business associates, former partners. Everyone seemed to have the same question. How much had Richard left behind? Nobody knew. And that uncertainty created tension. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed the estate was worth over $100 million. Others believed it was much larger. A few insisted Richard had quietly donated most of his fortune before his death. Everyone had a theory. Nobody had facts. Meanwhile, I followed Richard's instructions. I stayed away from the estate. Daniel insisted it was the safest decision. Let Margaret believe she still controls the situation. Those words stayed with me. Because deep down, I knew he was right. People often reveal the most when they think they've already won. Late Thursday night, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't Margaret. It was Olivia, Richard's youngest daughter, Michael's sister, the only member of the family who had consistently treated me with kindness. Emily. Her voice sounded hesitant. Hi, Olivia. There was a pause. Then she asked quietly, Is everything okay? I almost laughed. Nothing was okay, but I understood what she really meant. She had heard rumors. Everyone had. I'm managing. Another pause. Then Olivia surprised me. Mom's acting strange. I sat up straighter. What do you mean? I don't know. Her voice dropped. She's nervous. That single word caught my attention. Nervous. Very. Olivia sounded genuinely confused. I've never seen her like this before. Neither had I. Margaret Whitmore wasn't the nervous type. She was confident, controlled, calculated. If she was afraid now, there had to be a reason. Olivia continued. She's been meeting with lawyers all week. I exchanged a glance with Daniel, who was sitting across the room. He immediately noticed my expression. Several lawyers, Olivia added. Not just one. That was interesting. Very interesting. Because innocent people rarely hire multiple attorneys before a will reading. What else? I asked. Olivia hesitated. Then she lowered her voice even further. I heard her yelling. At who? I don't know. About what? Money. Of course. Everything came back to money. After the call ended, Daniel looked thoughtful. That's not good. What isn't? If Margaret is panicking now, it means she knows something significant is coming. I thought about that. Then I remembered the $5 million offer. The attempt to buy my silence. The sudden kindness. The fake concern. Margaret wasn't acting out of confidence. She was acting out of fear. And fear makes people unpredictable. The next morning arrived faster than expected. Friday. The day Richard had anticipated. The day Margaret had unknowingly been moving toward for nearly 2 years. I dressed carefully. Simple navy blue dress. Minimal jewelry. Nothing flashy. Nothing dramatic. I wasn't there to impress anyone. I was there because Richard had asked me to attend. That alone was enough. At 9:30, Daniel arrived to pick us up. Noah stayed with a family friend. This meeting wasn't a place for an 8-year-old boy. As we approached the law office, I immediately noticed the crowd. Luxury cars lined the street. Reporters stood outside the building. Apparently news of Richard's estate had attracted attention. Daniel shook his head. We'll use the side entrance. Good idea. The last thing I wanted was a camera in my face. Inside, the atmosphere felt tense. The conference room was already filling with people. Family members occupied one side. Business associates occupied another. Several attorneys sat near the front. Then I saw Margaret. She looked perfect. As always. Perfect suit. Perfect makeup. Perfect posture. Yet something was different. The confidence was gone. Not entirely, but enough that I noticed. She looked tired, worried. And when our eyes met, I saw something I'd never seen before. Uncertainty. For a brief moment, neither of us looked away. Then she turned her attention elsewhere. Daniel guided me toward a seat near the front. Minutes later, the room became silent. Attorney Charles Henderson entered carrying a thick leather briefcase. I recognized the name immediately. One of the most respected estate attorneys in the state. If Richard had trusted him, there was a reason. Charles sat down and adjusted his glasses. Then he opened the briefcase. The room remained perfectly quiet. Finally, he spoke. Thank you all for attending. His voice carried authority. Calm. Professional. Controlled. We are here today to review the final wishes of Richard William Whitmore. A ripple of emotion moved through the room. Charles continued. As many of you know, Mr. Whitmore spent considerable time preparing his estate. Several people nodded. Margaret remained motionless. Charles opened the first document. Then he began reading. The opening sections were routine. Charitable donations. Specific gifts. Family keepsakes. Several properties. Investment accounts. Nothing shocking. Nothing unusual. People listened politely. Some took notes. Others appeared bored. Then Charles reached another page. And everything changed. He looked directly at Margaret. Then he cleared his throat. Before proceeding further, I have been instructed to read a statement written personally by Mr. Whitmore. The room immediately became attentive. Even Margaret shifted in her chair. Charles unfolded a separate sheet of paper. Then he began. If this statement is being read, then certain events have likely occurred exactly as I predicted. A murmur spread across the room. I felt my pulse quicken. Charles continued. I have spent the last 18 months restructuring my estate to protect those I love. Every word landed like a hammer. Across the room, Margaret's face slowly lost color. And for the very first time, I realized Richard's final plan was finally beginning. End of Part 7. Part 8. English. The conference room was completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the reporters seated near the back seemed frozen. Attorney Charles Henderson adjusted the paper in front of him and continued reading Richard's statement. I am fully aware that some individuals may be surprised by the decisions outlined today. A nervous laugh escaped someone near the back of the room. Nobody joined in. Charles continued. My responsibility was never to make everyone happy. A few heads nodded. Only to protect the people who depended on me. I felt my throat tighten, because I knew exactly who Richard meant. Across the room, Margaret sat perfectly still, but her hands were no longer steady. For the first time, I noticed her fingers gripping the armrests of her chair. Hard. Very hard. Charles continued reading. To accomplish that goal, I established the Whitmore Family Legacy Trust. The room immediately erupted into whispers. Trust. The word spread through the crowd like wildfire. Business associates exchanged glances. Family members looked confused. Several attorneys suddenly became very interested. Charles waited for the noise to settle. Then he continued. The majority of my personal and business assets have been transferred into the trust. This time the reaction was louder. Much louder. People began speaking over one another. Questions filled the room. Margaret's face turned completely pale. Charles raised his hand. Please. The room slowly quieted. He continued. The estimated current value of the trust is approximately $200 million. Silence. Absolute silence. Then chaos. Gasps echoed throughout the room. Someone actually dropped a pen. A woman near the back covered her mouth. $200 million. Even though I already knew the number, hearing it spoken aloud felt different. More real. More powerful. And infinitely more dangerous. Charles waited patiently. Eventually the room settled again. Then he reached for another document. The trust contained specific instructions regarding distribution. Every eye in the room followed him, especially Margaret's. Her entire future depended on the next few minutes. Charles opened the document, then began reading. Upon my death, control of the Whitmore Family Legacy Trust shall transfer immediately to the designated trustees. Margaret leaned forward. Finally, something she understood. Power, control, ownership. These were things she cared about. Charles continued. The primary trustee shall be Daniel Brooks. The room exploded. Margaret shot to her feet. What? Her voice echoed across the conference room. Daniel didn't move, didn't react, didn't even blink. Charles remained calm. Please sit down, Mrs. Whitmore. Margaret stared at him, furious, humiliated, shocked, then slowly sat back down. Charles continued. The secondary trustee shall be Emily Whitmore. This time I stopped breathing. Me? Around the room, dozens of heads turned in my direction. I could feel every eye staring at me. Margaret looked as if she had been struck. No. She whispered the word. Then louder. No. Charles ignored her. As trustees, Daniel Brooks and Emily Whitmore shall oversee all trust assets according to the terms outlined by Richard Whitmore. Margaret stood again. This is ridiculous. Her voice cracked. Years of control were slipping away in real time, and everyone could see it. Charles calmly adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Whitmore, if you interrupt again, I will ask security to escort you out. The room became silent once more. Margaret slowly sat down. But the damage was done. Everyone had witnessed her panic. Everyone had seen her lose control. Charles continued. The trust income shall provide lifetime financial security for all direct descendants of the Whitmore family. Several relatives visibly relaxed. That part sounded reasonable. Then came the next section, and everything changed again. Margaret Whitmore shall receive an annual allowance of $500,000. Several people frowned. The number sounded large, until they remembered the trust was worth $200 million. Suddenly it seemed very small. Charles kept reading. Margaret Whitmore shall hold no authority over trust assets, investments, business operations, or future distributions. Another gasp spread across the room. Margaret's face turned red, then white, then red. Again, she looked like she might collapse. Charles continued. Any legal challenge initiated by Margaret Whitmore against the trust shall immediately terminate her financial benefits. The room erupted. Again, people couldn't believe what they were hearing. Richard had anticipated everything. Every challenge, every argument, every lawsuit. He had built defenses against all of it. And Margaret knew it. I could see the realization forming behind her eyes. The trap had already closed. Years ago, long before she even realized it existed. Then Charles reached the final page. The page Daniel and I had never seen. The page Richard had kept hidden from everyone. Charles took a breath, then began reading. Finally, there is one additional matter. The room became silent. Every person present leaned forward. Charles looked directly at me, then at Margaret, then back at the document. Regarding my grandson, Noah Whitmore. My heart immediately began racing. Noah. What about Noah? Charles continued. On Noah Whitmore's 25th birthday, he shall receive full ownership of 51% of Whitmore Holdings. The room exploded for a third time. But this time, Margaret didn't say a word. Because she wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't shocked anymore. She wasn't even arguing. She simply stared ahead. Frozen. Completely frozen. Because everyone in the room understood exactly what that meant. Richard hadn't merely protected Noah. He had made him the future owner of the family empire. And in a single sentence, Margaret lost everything she had spent years trying to control. End of Part 8. Part 9, English. For several seconds after Charles finished reading, nobody spoke. The room seemed unable to process what had just happened. 51%. Not a minority share. Not a symbolic inheritance. Control. Richard had handed control of Whitmore Holdings to Noah. The future of the family empire belonged to an 8-year-old boy. Or more precisely, it would one day belong to him. Across the room, Margaret remained frozen. The expression on her face was unlike anything I had ever seen. Not anger. Not sadness. Not even disbelief. It looked more like realization. The realization that a game she thought she was winning had ended long ago. And she hadn't even known. Charles allowed the silence to linger. Then he continued. There is one final provision. Immediately, every head turned toward him. One final provision? Apparently, Richard wasn't finished yet. Charles unfolded another page. His expression changed slightly. Almost amused. That caught my attention. Charles Henderson was not a man who showed emotion easily. Yet something about this page seemed different. He cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore anticipated that certain individuals might challenge the legitimacy of his decisions. A few attorneys shifted in their seats. Margaret stared straight ahead. Motionless. Charles continued. Therefore, all decisions outlined within the Whitmore Family Legacy Trust have been independently reviewed by 3 separate legal teams, 2 financial oversight firms, and a federal compliance auditor. A ripple moved through the room. That was significant. Very significant. Richard hadn't merely created a trust. He had fortified it, built walls around it, protected it from every angle. Charles continued. Any attempt to invalidate the trust shall automatically trigger the release of supplementary documentation. Daniel suddenly sat straighter. So did I? This was new. Very new. Charles looked down at the document. Then read the next line. The supplementary documentation includes financial records, correspondence, recorded statements, and investigative findings collected during the final 18 months of my life. The room exploded with whispers. Recorded statements? Investigative findings? Even several attorneys looked surprised. Across the room, Margaret finally reacted. Her head snapped upward. For the first time that morning, genuine fear appeared in her eyes. Charles kept reading. If such documents become necessary, they will be released publicly. The room became silent again. Everyone understood exactly what that meant. Publicly. Not privately. Not confidentially. Publicly. Richard had prepared an insurance policy. One final safeguard. If anyone tried to destroy his plan, he would expose everything. Even from beyond the grave. Margaret's hands began trembling visibly. She knew. Whatever was hidden inside those documents. She knew. Charles placed the page down, then folded his hands together. That concludes Mr. Whitmore's statement. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Finally, one of the attorneys stood. Are we to understand that Mr. Whitmore anticipated litigation? Charles answered immediately. Yes. Another attorney spoke. And prepared evidence accordingly? Yes. The room became restless. People started connecting the dots. The implications were enormous. Then Margaret suddenly stood. Again. But this time she wasn't angry. She looked desperate. Charles. Her voice shook. The entire room turned toward her. May I speak with you privately? Charles didn't hesitate. No. The answer landed like a hammer. Margaret blinked. Clearly, she wasn't accustomed to hearing that word. No. Charles calmly adjusted his glasses. Not regarding matters already entered into the official record. Margaret's face flushed. You don't understand. Charles looked directly at her. I assure you, Mrs. Whitmore. His voice remained perfectly calm. I understand far more than you think. The room fell silent. Margaret looked as though she had been slapped. Then she sat down again. Slowly, carefully, like someone whose legs could no longer support them. Meanwhile, my own mind was racing. Public documents. Recorded statements. Investigative findings. How much had Richard uncovered? And more importantly, how much had he hidden? As people began discussing the will among themselves, Charles gathered several folders from the table. Then he looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Brooks. Daniel stood. Charles handed him a sealed envelope. Heavy. Official. Marked with Richard's personal seal. I immediately recognized it. The same seal Richard used on confidential corporate documents. Daniel accepted the envelope carefully. What is this? Charles answered simply. The next step. A chill ran through me. The next step. Richard was still guiding events. Still moving pieces across the board. Even now. Even after death. Daniel slowly broke the seal. Inside was a single letter. He read the first few lines. Then stopped. His eyes widened. For the first time all day, Daniel Brooks looked shocked. Genuinely shocked. What is it? I whispered. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reread the page. Then looked at me. Then looked across the room toward Margaret. Finally, he spoke. Richard knew. The words barely left his mouth. My pulse accelerated. Knew what? Daniel lowered the letter. His face had gone pale. He knew exactly where the missing $50 million went. The room fell silent once more. Because several people had heard him. And across the room, Margaret Whitmore closed her eyes, as if she already knew what was coming next. End of Part 9. Part 10, English. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. $50 million. Missing. And Richard had known exactly where it went. Every eye in the room shifted toward Margaret. She remained seated. Her eyes closed. Her face pale. For the first time since I had met her, she looked defeated. Not angry. Not manipulative. Not calculating. Defeated. Daniel looked down at the letter again. His hands tightened slightly around the paper. There's more. The room immediately became silent. Charles nodded. Please continue. Daniel took a slow breath, then began reading aloud. If you are hearing these words, then the truth can no longer remain hidden. A chill ran through me. Even after death, Richard still commanded the room. Everyone listened. No one dared interrupt. Daniel continued. Approximately 23 months before my death, I became aware of significant discrepancies within several corporate accounts. Several business associates exchanged uneasy looks. Daniel read on. Initially, I believed these discrepancies were bookkeeping errors. A pause. Unfortunately, I was wrong. Across the room, Margaret lowered her head. Daniel continued. My investigation uncovered a systematic diversion of company funds through shell corporations, fraudulent consulting agreements, and unauthorized transfers. Gasps spread through the room. Several attorneys immediately began taking notes. Others looked stunned. Daniel kept reading. The total amount diverted exceeded $50 million. The room exploded with whispers. $50 million. Not 5. Not 10. 50. A staggering amount. Even among wealthy people. Daniel raised the letter slightly. His voice remained steady. I chose not to act immediately. That sentence surprised everyone, including me. Why wouldn't Richard act? Daniel continued reading. Instead, I documented everything. Now it made sense. Every note. Every investigation. Every record. Richard had been building a case. A very large case. Then came the next sentence. And the room went silent again. Because I wanted to know who was responsible. My heart pounded. Slowly. Heavily. The answer was coming. Everyone knew it. Margaret knew it too. Daniel swallowed hard. Then continued. The evidence ultimately led to one individual. No one breathed. No one moved. The tension felt unbearable. Daniel looked up from the letter. His eyes briefly met mine. Then he continued reading. Margaret Whitmore. The room erupted. People stood. Voices rose. Questions flew in every direction. Several relatives looked shocked. Others looked horrified. A few seemed strangely unsurprised, as though suspicions had existed for years. Margaret didn't move. She simply stared at the table, expressionless. Daniel continued despite the chaos. Margaret did not act alone. The room quieted slightly. Another name? Another person? Daniel continued. She received assistance from financial advisor Gregory Stanton. Immediately, one attorney near the back cursed under his breath. Apparently, he recognized the name. Daniel kept reading. All supporting documentation has been secured with legal counsel and federal authorities. That changed everything. This wasn't merely a family scandal. This wasn't just an inheritance dispute. Federal authorities. The implications were enormous. Margaret slowly raised her head. For the first time, she spoke. Richard is lying. The room froze. Her voice sounded weak, fragile, nothing like the woman who had thrown Noah and me out of the estate. Charles immediately responded. Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Whitmore's evidence was independently verified. Margaret stared at him. No. Charles remained calm. Yes. The single word hit harder than any argument. Because it wasn't emotional. It wasn't personal. It was factual. Verified. Documented. Confirmed. Margaret looked around the room. Searching. Looking for support. For allies. For anyone willing to defend her. She found none. Not one. Even Olivia looked devastated. Tears filled her eyes. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. This was betrayal. Years of betrayal. Then Daniel continued reading. There is one final matter. The room became silent once more. Somehow, Richard still wasn't finished. Daniel read the final paragraph. If Margaret chooses accountability and cooperation, I hope she finds peace. I closed my eyes. That sounded exactly like Richard. Firm. Fair. Compassionate. Even now. Even after everything. Then Daniel read the last sentence. If she does not, the sealed evidence package labeled Horizon shall be delivered immediately. Charles suddenly sat straighter. Several attorneys exchanged looks. The name clearly meant something. Horizon? Someone asked. Daniel lowered the letter, then looked toward Charles. Charles slowly nodded. His expression had become serious. Very serious. What is Horizon? A relative asked. For the first time all day, Charles hesitated. Then he answered. Horizon contains material that was never intended to become public. The room became uneasy. What kind of material? Charles looked directly at Margaret, then spoke quietly. The kind that could result in criminal charges. A collective gasp filled the room. Margaret's face lost all remaining color. Criminal charges. Not civil lawsuits. Not financial penalties. Criminal charges. The difference was enormous. Margaret slowly stood. Everyone watched. No one spoke. For several seconds, she simply looked around the room. At her children. At her relatives. At her attorneys. At Daniel. At me. Finally, her eyes stopped on Richard's portrait hanging near the front of the room. And something inside her seemed to break. Her shoulders slumped. Her posture collapsed. The fight disappeared. For the first time in years, Margaret Whitmore looked like an old woman. Not a powerful matriarch. Not a wealthy socialite. Just an old woman who had lost. Then, barely above a whisper, she spoke. I never imagined it would end this way. The room froze. Because everyone understood what that meant. It wasn't a denial. It wasn't a defense. It was a confession. And in that moment, Richard Whitmore won his final battle. Even though he wasn't there to see it. End of Part 10. Part 11. English. The room remained frozen. Margaret's confession lingered in the air. I never thought he'd find out. Nobody knew how to respond. Because there was nothing left to debate. Nothing left to deny. Richard had been right. All along. Margaret slowly lowered herself back into her chair. The confidence that had once defined her was gone. Completely gone. She looked exhausted. Like someone carrying a burden for far too long. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Olivia stood. Tears streamed down her face. Mom. Her voice cracked. Margaret didn't look up. Olivia took a hesitant step forward. Please tell me this isn't true. The entire room watched. Margaret remained silent. Mom. Olivia's voice broke again. Still nothing. That silence answered the question more clearly than words ever could. Olivia covered her mouth and began crying. One of her cousins moved beside her, trying to comfort her, trying to understand, trying to process the fact that the woman she had trusted her entire life was now sitting in the middle of a scandal worth $50 million. Across the room, several relatives quietly stood and moved away from Margaret. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just instinctively. People distanced themselves from collapsing structures. and Margaret's world was collapsing. Charles eventually cleared his throat. There are still administrative matters that must be addressed. His professionalism somehow remained intact despite the chaos. He opened another folder. The trustees will need to review the Horizon package before making any decisions. My stomach tightened. The Horizon package. The mysterious evidence Richard had hidden. Daniel looked equally concerned. How extensive is it? He asked. Charles hesitated, then answered honestly. Much larger than most people expect. The room became quiet again. Daniel exchanged a glance with me. Neither of us liked the sound of that. Charles continued. Richard spent nearly 2 years preparing it. 2 years. The same period during which he had quietly investigated everything. The same period during which Margaret thought she was winning. I suddenly realized something. Richard hadn't spent his final years planning revenge. He had spent them protecting the future. There was a difference. A very important difference. Revenge destroys. Protection preserves. That was who Richard had always been. A builder, not a destroyer. As the meeting slowly began breaking apart, attorneys gathered documents. Relatives formed small groups. Reporters outside somehow sensed something significant had happened. Phones began ringing throughout the room. News was already spreading. Then something unexpected happened. Margaret stood again. This time no one stopped her. She walked slowly across the room. Not toward the exit. Toward me. Every conversation immediately stopped. Dozens of eyes followed her. Even Charles watched carefully. Margaret stopped a few feet away. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I honestly didn't know what she was going to do. Neither did anyone else. Then she looked at me. Really looked at me. Perhaps for the first time in years. And quietly said, I'm sorry. The words stunned the room. Not because they were loud, but because they seemed genuine. Margaret Whitmore had never apologized for anything. At least not anything important. Yet now the words came easily. Without excuses. Without conditions. Without manipulation. Just 3 simple words. I'm sorry. I stared at her, trying to decide how I felt. Angry? Relieved? Satisfied? The truth was more complicated. I felt tired. Very tired. Because no apology could erase what had happened. No apology could return the years Noah and I had spent feeling unwanted. No apology could bring Michael back. No apology could undo the choices Margaret had made. But still, it mattered. Not because it fixed anything. Because it acknowledged reality. Finally, Margaret lowered her eyes. Then looked toward the photograph of Richard positioned near the front of the room. Her voice became barely audible. I loved him. Nobody spoke. Nobody interrupted. Margaret continued. I know nobody believes that now. A tear rolled down her cheek. But I did. For the first time, she looked less like a villain and more like a tragic figure. Someone whose greed had gradually consumed everything else. Including love. Including family. Including herself. She wiped her eyes. Then looked at me again. Take care of Noah. I blinked. Of all the things she could have said, that wasn't what I expected. Margaret gave a small nod. Then turned toward the exit. Nobody stopped her. Nobody followed her. The room parted silently as she walked away. And just like that, the most powerful woman in the Whitmore family disappeared through a doorway alone. End of Part 11. Part 12, English. The door closed softly behind Margaret. And just like that, she was gone. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The silence felt different now. Not tense. Not hostile. Just reflective. As if everyone in the room had suddenly realized they had witnessed the end of something. An era. A family battle. A decades-long struggle for power. Richard Whitmore's final chapter had finally been written. Charles was the first to break the silence. I believe Mr. Whitmore would have wanted us to move forward. Simple words. But they carried weight. Because moving forward was exactly what Richard had spent his final years trying to ensure. Not revenge. Not punishment. The future. Daniel nodded. Then carefully placed the letter back into its envelope. I think he's right. One by one, people began leaving. Some quietly. Some emotionally. Some still trying to understand everything they had learned that morning. Olivia approached me before leaving. Her eyes were still red from crying. For a moment, neither of us knew what to say. Then she hugged me. Unexpectedly. Genuinely. I'm sorry, Emily. I wrapped my arms around her. You don't have anything to apologize for. A tear rolled down her cheek. I should have seen it. No. I shook my head. You loved your mother. Olivia closed her eyes. Perhaps that was the tragedy of it all. Love often makes us blind. Not because we're foolish. Because we want to believe the best in the people we care about. Eventually, she nodded and left. By early afternoon, only a handful of people remained. Daniel, Charles, a few attorneys, and me. The reporters were still waiting outside. But none of us were ready to face them. Not yet. Charles gathered the remaining files, then handed me a small envelope. Unlike the others, this one wasn't sealed. I recognized Richard's handwriting immediately. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A personal letter. For me. I swallowed hard and began reading. Emily, if you're reading this, then everything unfolded the way I feared it might. First, I want to say something I should have said much sooner. Thank you. Thank you for loving my son. Thank you for loving my grandson. And thank you for staying when it would have been easier to leave. My vision blurred. I blinked back tears and continued. You were never an outsider. Not to me. You became family the day Michael chose you. And you remained family long after we lost him. I had to stop reading for a moment. The ache of Michael's absence never truly disappeared. Some wounds simply become part of who we are. I continued. Noah will need guidance. Not wealth. Not power. Guidance. Teach him kindness before business. Teach him character before success. Teach him that people matter more than money. If you can do that, everything else will take care of itself. A tear slipped down my cheek. Because those words sounded exactly like Richard. Not a billionaire. Not a businessman. A grandfather. A father. A good man. I reached the final paragraph. One day Noah will inherit an empire. But my greatest hope is that he never measures himself by what he owns. Only by how he treats others. That is the true Whitmore legacy. The letter ended with a simple signature. Richard. Nothing more. Nothing less. I folded the letter carefully, then pressed it against my chest. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice. And somehow, it felt like goodbye. Weeks passed. Then months. The headlines eventually faded. The investigations continued. Gregory Stanton was charged. Several financial crimes were confirmed. Margaret accepted responsibility and cooperated with authorities. The Horizon package never became public. Just as Richard had hoped. Some things remained private. Some wounds did not need to become spectacles. Over time, the Whitmore family slowly began healing. Not perfectly, not quickly, but genuinely. Olivia became a regular part of Noah's life. Family dinners returned. Laughter slowly returned. Trust took longer, but it returned too. As for the company, Daniel and I followed Richard's instructions. Carefully, patiently, responsibly. Years later, on Noah's 18th birthday, we visited Richard's grave together. Noah had grown into a remarkable young man. Thoughtful, kind, strong. Exactly the kind of person Richard had hoped he would become. We stood quietly beneath the afternoon sun. Then Noah smiled. You know, Grandpa was pretty smart. I laughed. That's one way to describe him. Noah grinned. He beat everybody. For a second, I thought about it. Then I shook my head. No. Noah looked surprised. No. I smiled. He didn't beat everybody. Then what did he do? I looked toward the headstone. Toward the name carved into the stone. Toward the man who had protected us all. And finally answered. He made sure the right people won. Noah followed my gaze. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then we stood together in comfortable silence. The wind moved gently through the trees. The sun shone warmly above us. And for the first time in a very long time, everything felt exactly as it should. The end.